The dress was perfect. I need you to know that first, before anything else, because the dress matters in a way that will make sense later. It was ivory silk with a cathedral train and hand-sewn beading along the bodice that caught the light differently depending on which way you turned. And I had tried it on 4 times in the 6 weeks between the final fitting and the wedding morning, and each time, the woman in the mirror looked like someone I had been working toward my entire life. Not because of the dress. Because of what the dress represented. 5 years of choosing someone. 5 years of building toward a single morning in October in a chapel in Concord, Massachusetts, where 212 people were seated in white chairs with cream ribbons, and a string quartet was playing, and the air smelled like the lilies I had spent 3 weeks selecting from 12 different florists. I had done everything right. That is what I need you to understand. I had done everything a woman is told to do. I had been patient and careful and present and generous, and I had chosen a man who told me he loved me every morning without fail, and who held my hand in public, and who made my mother laugh, and who had, 14 months earlier, gotten down on one knee at the restaurant where we had our first date and produced a ring that was exactly what I would have chosen for myself. I had done everything right. And at 11:47 on the morning of October 19th, standing in the bridal suite of the Concord Chapel, with 17 minutes remaining before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, I found out that everything right had been built on something that was not right at all. My name is Zara Nicole Beaumont. I am 32 years old, and this is the story of the 17 minutes that changed every single thing. I need to take you back before I can take you forward, because the 17 minutes only mean what they mean if you understand what came before them. His name was Elliot James Caldwell. I met him at a conference in Chicago 3 days before my 27th birthday. He was presenting a paper on urban development policy, and I was there representing my firm, a mid-sized consulting company where I was the youngest senior analyst they had ever promoted. He was 31, tall, sandy-haired, with the particular kind of confidence that comes from being consistently good at things and knowing it without being insufferable about it. He made a joke during the Q&A that was genuinely funny, which is rarer than it should be at academic conferences, and I laughed, and he found me at the reception afterward and said, "I'm glad you thought that was funny." "Most people didn't," I said. "Most people weren't listening closely enough." He said, "And you were." I said, "I'm always listening closely." He looked at me with the specific attention of someone filing something away. He said, "I believe that." And then he asked if he could buy me a drink. We talked for 3 hours at that conference reception, not the talking of two people performing interest. The talking of two people who have found a frequency and are surprised by the finding. He was from Boston, which is where I was from. He was the second of 3 children from a family in Wellesley. His father was a retired judge. His mother ran a nonprofit focused on education reform. He asked about my family. I told him about Mama, who was a nurse and had raised me and my brother Marcus alone in Dorchester after my father died when I was 9. He listened with the kind of attention that made me feel the information was being held carefully and not catalogued for later use. He asked what I was reading. He asked what I thought about 3 specific things happening in the city that month. He asked if I had a particular theory about why certain kinds of urban development consistently failed communities they were designed to serve. I had a very specific theory. I told him. He argued with 2 parts of it and agreed with the third, and we were still talking when the reception staff started putting chairs on tables. I flew back to Boston 2 days later with his number in my phone and a feeling in my chest that I was working to keep proportionate. He texted before I landed. We dated for 18 months before he met my mother. This is something I want to address directly because some people hear that number and assume it means something was being hidden or delayed. It was not. Mama meeting the man I was seeing was a threshold I protected carefully, because Mama had opinions and the ability to express them with the specificity of a surgical instrument, and I needed to be certain before I opened that door. By month 18, I was certain. Mama met Elliot on a Sunday afternoon in November at her apartment in Dorchester, which she had lived in for 22 years and which she kept with the exacting cleanliness of a woman who believed that your environment was a statement of your self-respect. She made pot roast. She set the table properly, with the good china she kept for important occasions. She wore the blue dress. Elliot brought flowers and wine and a specific genuine curiosity about everything Mama said that I could tell was not performed because I had seen him perform curiosity and it looked different from the real version. He asked her about her nursing career. He asked about my father. He asked about Dorchester, how it had changed, what the changes had cost the people who had been there longest. Mama answered everything directly, which was her only mode, and then she looked at him across the table with the look that I had seen her level at exactly 3 people in my lifetime and said, "You make my daughter happy, not a question." Elliot said, "I'm trying to." Mama said, "Trying is not sufficient, being is what's required." Elliot said, "Then being, she makes me want to be everything I keep telling myself I'll get around to being." Mama looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "More pot roast." That was the Mama version of approval. I took it. His family was different. His family was always going to be different, and I understood that from the beginning, and I want to be clear that understanding something does not mean it doesn't cost you anything. It costs you. Understanding that you are walking into a room that has a specific relationship with people who look like you. Understanding that the family photo albums in the house in Wellesley do not contain faces like yours. Understanding that you are, in every gathering, the only one, and that this means something different to different people in the room. Understanding all of that does not make the understanding painless. His mother, Caroline Caldwell, was the kind of white liberal who had done a semester abroad in South Africa in 1987 and had never quite stopped referencing it. She was warm with the warmth of someone who wanted very much to be seen as warm, and who had therefore practiced warmth into something that no longer quite resembled the original. She hugged me immediately upon meeting me and said, "Zara, we have heard so much about you," and the emphasis on so much made me understand that the so much had been a process of preparing rather than simply sharing. His father, Thomas, was a retired judge with the economy of a man who had spent decades measuring words before releasing them. He shook my hand and said, "Good to meet you, Zara." He said it the way he probably said it to everyone, and I decided to take it at face value because the alternative was exhausting. His sister, Margaret, 34, was the one who made me feel the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being studied. She was a documentary filmmaker, progressive in the particular way of people who have spent significant energy developing the vocabulary of progressivism without necessarily examining the assumptions underneath it. She asked me questions about my background with an interest that was genuine and also curatorial, the way you are interested in something you intend to document. His brother, Henry, 28, was the one I liked immediately and consistently. He was younger and less formed and more honest about his own confusion, which I found refreshing. He said to me once, at a family dinner about 6 months into Elliot and my relationship, "I want you to know I think my family is trying really hard." I said, "I know." He said, "I also want you to know that trying hard and getting it right are different things." I said, "I know that too." He looked at me with recognition and said, "I figured you did." We became, over the following years, genuinely close. Henry was the one I trusted in that family. He was the one who would become important to the story. The engagement happened at month 31. I told you about the restaurant, the ring, the speech that was rehearsed in the best way. What I did not tell you was the conversation that happened 3 days before the proposal, a conversation I did not know was happening, which was between Elliot and his father. I did not know about this conversation until later, much later, the morning of the wedding later. But I am getting to that. The 14 months between the engagement and the wedding were the months of planning and also the months of small accumulations that I noticed and managed and told myself were manageable. The accumulations were in the family. They were things like Caroline suggesting, gently, that perhaps the ceremony could be at their church in Wellesley rather than at the Concord chapel I had chosen. They were things like Thomas making a comment at a family dinner about the guest list, about how large my side of the family was, with the specific quality of observation that is not quite complaint and is not quite nothing either. They were things like Margaret asking if she could film segments of the wedding preparation for a project she was developing about interracial marriages, which I said no to with the pleasantness of a woman who has learned that no is a complete sentence, but whose no was received as an opportunity for further discussion rather than a decision. They were things like the rehearsal dinner conversation. The rehearsal dinner was 2 nights before the wedding at the Caldwell family home in Wellesley. It was a beautiful house, as it had always been, and Caroline had arranged it beautifully, and the food was excellent and the evening was pleasant on the surface in the way that the Caldwell family events were always pleasant on the surface. At some point during the dinner, Thomas gave a toast. He spoke about Elliot with the specific warm economy of a father who was proud of his son, and expressed that pride in measured terms that still managed to be moving. He said some things about love and about marriage, and about what he hoped for his son's future. He did not say my name. Not once. Not in 7 minutes of speaking about the upcoming marriage of his son. He spoke about Elliot and his hopes for Elliot and his love for Elliot and his pride in Elliot, and the woman his son was about to marry was referred to twice as his partner, and once, in a phrasing so careful it had clearly been considered as the person he has chosen. The person he has chosen. Not Zara, not our future daughter-in-law, not even his fiancé, which was accurate and neutral and would have been the minimum. The person he has chosen. I sat at that rehearsal dinner, and I held my face, and I held my glass, and I did not look at Elliot because I did not want to see his face processing this in real time while I was processing it because I needed my processing to be my own for a moment. Henry caught my eye from across the table. His expression said, "I know." Mine said, "I know you know." We did not say anything out loud. Elliot squeezed my hand under the table. He had heard it too. He said nothing. That night in the hotel where my family and bridal party were staying, I called my best friend and maid of honor, Simone, who had been my best friend since the 7th grade and who was the most direct person I had ever known in my life, and I told her about the toast. Simone said, "Zara." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you sure about this?" I said, "I love him." She said, "I know you love him. That's not what I asked." I said, "Simone." She said, "I'm asking because it's my job to ask. Because I have been watching this family for 2 years and I have things I have not said because you didn't ask me to say them, and tonight I think maybe you're asking." I said, "Say them." She said, "His family has never fully claimed you. Not his mother, not his father, not the sister. Henry is fine. But Henry is one person out of a family. And Elliot has let it go on because he doesn't know how to stop it, and because stopping it would cost him something with his parents that he's not ready to pay. That's the truth, Zara. He loves you. I believe that completely. But love and courage are different things. I sat with that. Then I said, "But I've chosen him, Simone. I've chosen this." She said, "I know. I'm your maid of honor. I'm standing beside you tomorrow. I'm just asking you to choose it with your eyes open all the way." I said, "My eyes are open." She said, "Okay." I went to sleep. I had 17 minutes until everything changed. The morning of October 19th was the kind of October morning that seems designed for weddings, which is to say it had the specific golden light that comes through autumn leaves and turns everything it touches into the color of something worth keeping. I had been awake since 5, not with nerves exactly, with the particular heightened awareness of a person on the last morning of one version of her life. Simone and I had breakfast in the hotel room. She had ordered too much food because she always did when she was managing anxiety, and today she had 7 things to manage anxiety about, being my wedding the primary one. We ate, and she did my makeup with the focused calm of someone channeling everything into a task, and we talked about nothing important for 2 hours, which was the most important thing we could have done. My mother arrived at 9. She came through the door and saw me in the dress for the first time, and her face did the thing it does when something has exceeded what she had allowed herself to hope for, which is that it goes very still and then everything in it opens at once. She said, "Oh, baby, just that." And then she held my face in both her hands the way she had done since I was 3 years old, and she looked at me and she said, "You are ready." I said, "Are you sure?" She said, "I raised you to be ready for anything, including this." I hugged her. She smelled like the perfume she had worn my entire life, and it was the safest smell in the world. The photographer came at 10. The bridesmaids arrived in stages. The suite filled with the specific beautiful chaos of women preparing for a ceremony that 7 months of planning had been building toward. Flowers and champagne and the string quartet warming up somewhere in the building, audible through the walls as a distant honey-colored sound. At 11:30, Simone stood behind me at the mirror and said, 17 minutes, Zara. I looked at myself. I thought, okay, this is it. This is the person you are. This is the life you chose. And then Henry knocked on the door. I want to describe the knock because it was specific. It was not the knock of a groomsman with a message. It was not the knock of a florist with a final arrangement. It had a particular quality of urgency wrapped in the deliberate slowness of someone who was making themselves knock carefully because they wanted to knock very differently. Simone opened the door. Henry was standing there in his morning suit. He had dark circles under his eyes that suggested he had not slept, and his hair was slightly wrong, not styled, like he had run a hand through it too many times. He looked past Simone directly to me. He said, Zara, I need to talk to you. Right now. Simone moved in front of him instinctively, the way she had moved in front of me for 20 years when something was coming. She said, Henry, the ceremony is in 17 minutes. He said, I know. That's why it has to be right now, something in his voice. Simone looked at me. I nodded. She let him in. He crossed the room to where I was standing by the mirror, and he looked at me with the expression I had seen on his face at the rehearsal dinner, the I know expression, but worse. The I know something specific and I have been carrying it and I cannot carry it past this moment expression. He said, Zara, I have to tell you something. I should have told you earlier. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you for 3 weeks and I kept convincing myself it wasn't my place and that maybe it would resolve itself and I was wrong about both of those things. I said, Henry, say it. He said, my father called Elliot 3 days before he proposed to you. He had a conversation with him that he gave Elliot an ultimatum. He said that if Elliot married you, he would be excluded from the Caldwell family trust, specifically and completely. He said it would affect the estate and the business interests and his relationship with the family going forward. He told Elliot that marrying, and I'm quoting my father here, Zara, and I want you to know that I am telling you this because you deserve to know the exact words. He told Elliot that marrying outside of what the family expected was something he could not support financially or emotionally. The room was very quiet. I said, outside of what the family expected. Henry said, yes. I said, meaning me. Henry said, yes. I said, and Elliot proposed anyway. Henry said, yes. I said, and your father, Henry said, 2 months ago. My father changed his position. He told Elliot that he had reconsidered, that the trust would stand regardless. He said he had spoken to my mother and they had decided to, he looked at the floor and then back at me, to accept the situation. Accept the situation. I heard those words land in the room and felt them take up the space that air had been occupying. Accept the situation. I was the situation. I was the situation they had been debating and deliberating and applying financial leverage to for over a year of my engagement, and the conclusion they had arrived at was acceptance, which is not welcome, which is not love, which is not the embrace of a daughter who is marrying into your family, which is acceptance. the word you use for whether you cannot change. I said, and Elliot knew all of this. He knew about the ultimatum. He proposed after the ultimatum. Henry said, yes, I said, and he didn't tell me. Henry said, no, I said, in 14 months, not once. Henry said, no, Zara, I think he thought that if his father had come around, then it was resolved. That telling you would only, I said, would only what? Henry was quiet, I said, would only make me understand exactly what I was walking into, would only give me information that was mine to have, would only let me make a fully informed choice about the life I was choosing. Henry said very quietly, yes. The room was completely still. My mother was standing behind me. I had not looked at her, but I felt her. The specific warmth of her presence, which was its own kind of architecture. Simone was standing beside Henry with an expression that was managing about 14 things simultaneously, and she said nothing because she understood that this was not a moment for anyone's words except mine. I looked at myself in the mirror. The dress was still perfect. I stood there for a moment in the silence of that room, with the string quartet playing something that filtered through the walls, distant and oblivious, and I thought about 17 minutes and what they contained and what they were asking of me. And then I made a decision that I am going to tell you about. Not yet, because you need to be in that room with me for the next part. You need to feel what I felt and see what I saw. Stay with me. Before I tell you what I did, I need to tell you something else. Something that happened in the 3 weeks before the wedding that I did not understand at the time and that I understand now completely. Elliot had been different, not dramatically, not in a way that I had named clearly, but in the specific frequency of a person who is carrying something and is managing the carry rather than setting the thing down. He was slightly more present than usual, more deliberate in his affection, more careful about the specific words he used. He held my hand a beat longer than he normally did. He said I love you with a quality that I had registered and interpreted as wedding nerves, but that I now understood was the weight of information he had decided not to give me. He had been kind to me with the specific kindness of a guilty man, not a malicious man. I want to be very clear about that, because this story requires accuracy even when accuracy is complicated. And the accuracy is that Elliot James Caldwell was not a bad man. He was a man who had made a choice that was genuinely brave, proposing to me against his father's financial ultimatum, and then made a second choice that was genuinely cowardly, which was deciding that the story of the first brave choice did not require telling. He had wanted the credit for the courage without the transparency that the courage required. And I had been standing in the gap of that untold story for 14 months, planning a wedding and building a life in the space where the truth should have been. I thought about all of this in the mirror. I thought about Thomas's toast at the rehearsal dinner. The person he has chosen. I thought about Caroline's warmth, practiced and genuine simultaneously. The warmth of a woman who had worked through something and arrived at a position she could hold. I thought about Margot's documentary interest, the curatorial attention that had always made me feel like a subject rather than a person. I thought about Henry, who had not slept and who had knocked on the door anyway, who had decided that my right to know was more important than his comfort and his loyalty to a secret his family had been keeping. I thought about Elliot downstairs, in his morning suit, with 212 people waiting in the white chairs, with the string quartet playing. With 17 minutes on the clock, I thought about what it meant that he had proposed after the ultimatum. I held that thought. It was not a small thing. A man who proposes to a woman after his father has told him the proposal will cost him his inheritance is not a man without courage. He is a man who chose the woman over the money. That is real. That matters. That is not nothing. But a man who does not then tell that woman what she is walking into, what the architecture of the family she is marrying into actually looks like, what the conversation was, and what the words were, and what accept the situation means when it comes from the mouth of a man who used financial leverage to try to prevent the marriage. That man has made the other woman complicit in a story without her consent. I had been complicit in a story without my consent. For 14 months. I looked at the ring on my left hand. I looked at the dress. I looked at my mother behind me and Simone beside her and Henry at the door with his apologetic, carrying eyes. I said, okay. Not to the mirror, to myself. I said, okay. And I walked out the door. I want to tell you now about what happened when I walked into that chapel. I am going to be very precise because every detail of the next 40 minutes is permanently stored in me with the clarity of something that mattered completely. The chapel at Concord was full of golden October light through tall windows, and the white chairs, and the cream ribbons, and the lilies that had taken me 3 weeks to select. The string quartet was playing something I had chosen 8 months ago that I could not in this moment identify because I was not listening to the music, I was listening to everything else. 212 people. I saw them in pieces. My family on the left side, my mama's people, Dorchester people, the aunt who had flown from Atlanta, and the cousins who had driven from New York, and my brother Marcus, who had taken 2 days off from his job at the hospital, and who was sitting in the front row with his hands clasped, and his face doing the thing it does when he is proud of me, and trying not to show how proud he is. My friends, my colleagues, the women I had known since middle school, and the ones I had met in my professional life and Simone's family, who were also essentially my family. And on the right side, the Caldwell family and their people. Thomas in the front row with the economy of a man who had made his peace with a decision and was presenting that peace formally. Caroline beside him, in the blue she had chosen because she asked me what my color palette was, and I told her, and she had honored it, which I had found touching at the time, and which I was now seeing in a slightly different light. Margaret with her filmmakers, eye tracking everything. Henry at the end of the front row, who had taken his position after our conversation, and who was looking at me from the moment I appeared at the back of the chapel with the expression of a man who does not know what is about to happen and is genuinely afraid. And Elliot at the altar, in his mourning suit. And when he saw me, his face did something that I am going to be honest about because I am committed to accuracy. His face did the thing that faces do when they see the person they love arriving, the involuntary opening, the specific softness that cannot be performed, and I looked at that face, and I felt the full complexity of everything I was about to do. I walked down the aisle. Mama had my arm. We had agreed months ago that Mama would walk me down. She walked beside me with the specific quality of presence she brought to everything important, solid and warm and completely there. She did not look at me because she understood that what I needed from her right now was her body beside mine, not her eyes. I walked the full length of that aisle. I stood at the altar. The officiant smiled at me. He was a family friend of the Caldwells, a man named Reverend Morrison who had been warm and thoughtful in our pre-wedding sessions and who was now looking at me with the pleasant readiness of a man who expected a ceremony to unfold in the way ceremonies unfold. Elliot took my hands. He said very quietly, "You look, Zara, you look like everything." I looked at him. I said, "I need to say something." His face changed. The officiant said, "Of course, we're just about to," I said. "I need to say something to Elliot first, before we begin." Reverend Morrison looked at me with the careful attention of a man who had done enough weddings to know when something was happening that required his full presence. He said, "Of course." 212 people went very still. I looked at Elliot. I said, "Henry came to see me before I walked down." Something moved across Elliot's face. Not surprise. Not the surprise of someone who did not know what was coming. The specific expression of a man who had known this moment was possible and had arrived at it. He said, "Zara," I said, "I'm not finished." He closed his mouth. The chapel was the most complete silence I have ever been inside. I said, "Henry told me about your father's phone call. 3 days before you proposed to me. He told me about the ultimatum." Elliot's jaw moved. He said nothing. I said, "I want to ask you something. And I need the truth, not the managed version. Not the version where you decided what I needed to know and gave me that, the actual truth." He said, "Okay." I said, "Did you propose to me after your father told you it would cost you your inheritance?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Because you chose me over the money." He said, "Yes." I said, "And then you didn't tell me. In 14 months. He said, "I didn't want to." I said, "What? What didn't you want?" He was quiet for a moment. 212 people were not breathing. He said, "I didn't want you to feel like what we had was conditional on anything. I didn't want you to feel like the choice I made was about anything except wanting you. I thought if I told you, it would put his decision in the middle of our relationship, and I wanted our relationship to be about us." I looked at him. I said, "That is the most thoughtful and the most selfish thing I have ever heard anyone say." He looked at the floor. I said, "Thoughtful because you were trying to protect what we have, and selfish because you made that decision for me. You decided what I needed to know about my own life. You decided what information I was allowed to have about the family I was marrying into and the conversation that had been had about whether I was acceptable and what it was going to take to accept the situation. You decided that for me, without asking me." He said, I know I should have." I said, "Elliot, look at me." He looked at me. His eyes were the eyes of a man who was fully present in the consequence of his choice and not running from it. I said, "I need to ask you one more thing." He said, "Anything." I said, "When your father told you that marrying me would cost you your inheritance, what did you say to him?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I told him that he could do whatever he felt he needed to do with the trust. That I had found the person I wanted to spend my life with and that the trust had nothing to do with that." I said, "And when he called 2 months ago to say he had reconsidered," he said, "I told him I was glad he had come around. and I asked him to treat you with the respect you deserved. He said he would try. He would try. I thought about Thomas's toast, the person he has chosen. I thought about what trying looked like. I thought about what I was standing in the middle of. I need to stop here and speak to you directly. If you are watching this video on black diamonds and you have not yet subscribed, I need you to do that right now. This channel exists for this story, for this moment, for the women who have stood at altars of one kind or another and discovered in the last possible moment that the information they needed was being managed by someone who loved them, and that love and honesty are not the same thing and both are required. Subscribe, hit the bell, and drop your name and your city in the comments below. I want to know where you are tonight. I want to know if you have ever stood in a doorway like the one I was standing in. Because this community is a safe place, and you are not alone. Now, back to the altar. Because what I said next is the part nobody in that room expected. 212 people were waiting. Elliot was looking at me with the complete attention of a man who understood that the next thing I said was going to determine the shape of everything that followed. I took a breath. I said, I want to say something to your family. Something moved through the chapel, not a sound, a quality, the quality of a room that is realigning. I turned, not away from Elliot. I kept his hands in mine. I turned enough to address the front rows on the right side. I said, Thomas. Thomas Caldwell sat very still. I said, I know about the phone call. I know about the ultimatum. I know about accept the situation. The quality of the room changed again. I said, I am not angry with you. I want to be clear about that, because what I am about to say is not anger, and it's not performance, and it's not a scene. I am going to tell you the truth, and then I am going to make a decision, and I want you to understand that both of those things are my right. Thomas said nothing. I said, when you called your son and told him that marrying me would cost him his inheritance, you were telling him something about me. You were telling him that I was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be welcomed. You were applying the specific power of money to try to override your son's choice of the person he loved. And when that didn't work, and your son chose me anyway, you reconsidered. Not because your thinking changed, because the choice was already made. Because the situation, as you called it, was not going to resolve in the direction you had applied your financial leverage toward. So you accepted it. I paused. I said, I want you to know that I have known something was wrong with this picture for 2 years. I could not name it fully, but I felt it. I felt it in every dinner and every family gathering, and every time my name was not said when it should have been. I felt it the way you feel a draft in a room. You can't always find where it's coming from, but you know the warmth is not complete. I said, I am not going to pretend that I don't feel the full weight of what you did. I am not going to smile and accept the situation any more than the situation required me to accept. But I am also not going to let what you did define what I do next. Because what I do next is mine. It belongs to me. Not to your phone call, and not to your trust, and not to your willingness or unwillingness to say my name at a rehearsal dinner. Thomas Caldwell was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before. I turned back to Elliot. His eyes had not left me. I said, I love you. I want you to know that I am saying that right now as a fact that exists independently of everything else I have said and everything I am about to say. I love you. That is real, and it has always been real. He said, I know, I love you too. I know that doesn't, I said, it does. It counts. I want it to count. He said, then, I said, but I need you to understand something. When you decided not to tell me about your father's call, you made a decision about my life without me. And we cannot build a marriage on decisions made about my life without me. I won't be in a marriage where important information about my own story gets managed by someone who loves me and thinks the management is a kindness. He said, you're right, you're completely right. I said, I know. He said, what do you need? I looked at him. This was the question, not the performance question, not the question of a man trying to salvage a situation. The question of a man who was asking with his whole self what the person he had hurt needed in order for there to be a forward direction at all. I said, I need you to stand here in front of 212 people and tell me that you understand what you did wrong. Not in the managed way, the real way. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, loudly enough for the room to hear, I kept information from you that was yours to have. I made a decision about what you needed to know, and I made it without asking you, and I made it because I was afraid that the truth would hurt you or push you away, and I chose my fear over your right to the truth. I chose protecting myself from your reaction over respecting your ability to handle reality. That was wrong. It was wrong, and it was a failure, and you deserved better than that from the first day. The chapel held this. He said, and I am asking you, in front of everyone I know, and everyone you know, and everyone we both know, I am asking you if you will give me the chance to spend the rest of our lives doing better than that. I looked at him. I looked at my mother, who was sitting in the front row now, who had walked me down and then taken her seat, and who was looking at me with the look that meant, this is your life, baby, and you already know what to do with it. I looked at Simone, who was standing to my left with the composure of a woman who had prepared for multiple outcomes of this morning and was presently experiencing one of them. I looked at Henry, who was sitting at the end of the right front row with his hands clasped and his eyes doing something complicated and grateful. I looked at Thomas Caldwell. Thomas Caldwell was looking at me with the expression I had not seen before, which I now understood was the expression of a man encountering a moment that required more of him than he had prepared to give and knowing it. I said, Thomas. He said, yes. I said, I would like you to say my name. The chapel was entirely still. He said, Zara. I said again. He said, Zara Nicole Beaumont. I said, thank you. He nodded. Something in his face shifted. Not everything, not the full accounting, but the beginning of something that would need to happen over time rather than in a single chapel moment. I turned back to Elliot. I said, we are going to have a very specific conversation tonight, and tomorrow, and many days after that, because I am not going to simply fold this into the past and call it resolved. It is not resolved. It is a thing that happened, and we are going to look at it together directly and completely, and we are going to figure out what it means for us and what it requires of us both. He said, yes. I said, agreed. He said, agreed. Completely. I looked at him. At this man who had chosen me against a financial ultimatum and then failed to tell me and was standing here now in a morning suit with the truth finally occupying the space it should have occupied 14 months earlier. I said, okay. He said, okay. I said, okay, he understood. I turned to Reverend Morrison. I said, I think we're ready. Reverend Morrison looked at me with the expression of a man who had witnessed many ceremonies and had never quite witnessed this one and who was, beneath his professional composure, moved. He said, "Shall we begin?" And we began. The ceremony that followed was not the ceremony I had planned. The ceremony I had planned was the ceremony of a woman who believed she had all the information. The ceremony that actually happened was the ceremony of a woman who had stood in the full truth of her situation and chosen forward movement anyway, not because the situation was resolved, but because she had determined that the resolution was possible and that the person she was choosing was worth the work of getting there. Those are different ceremonies. The second one is harder and also more real. Reverend Morrison spoke about love as a practice rather than a state, which under the circumstances was the most useful thing he could have said. He spoke about truth as the foundation of everything else, which made Elliot look at me and me look at him with a shared acknowledgement of the full irony of the moment. He spoke about the commitment not as the end of a journey, but as the formal beginning of one. I said I do. Elliot said I do. It was the most informed I do I had ever witnessed. It was made of 17 minutes and 20 years, and a family's complicated reckoning and a man's choice and a woman's decision to walk into the full truth and still choose. The room applauded. My mother, in the front row, had both hands over her mouth and her eyes were full, and she was not pretending they weren't. Henry was the first Caldwell standing. The reception is where the story continued being told, in the small and specific ways that receptions tell stories. Thomas Caldwell came to find me in the first hour. Not during the receiving line, but after, when I was briefly alone at the edge of the dance floor watching Elliot talk to my brother. He approached in the way that men approach when they have thought carefully about the approach. He said, "Zara, just my name," without preamble. I said, "Thomas." He said, "I owe you more than an apology, I know that. I'm not going to insult you by offering something that insufficient as though it were sufficient. I need you to know that what you did this morning, the way you handled that, I have not seen anything like that in a very long time." I said, "What did you expect me to do?" He said, honestly, "I did not know what to expect. I have been operating from assumptions about," he paused, "about what this marriage would look like and what it would cost our family, and I understand now that the cost I was calculating was entirely the wrong one." He paused again. "I have been calculating in the wrong currency." I looked at him. I said, "Thomas, I am going to be part of your family now, and I am going to be part of it completely or not at all. I am not the situation. I am your son's wife. And I will need you to treat me that way going forward, not because I need your approval. I don't need your approval. I need your honesty. Can you give me that?" He said, "I can try." I said, "Trying is insufficient. Being is what's required." He looked at me with what I later identified as the specific expression of recognition, the expression of someone who has just heard something they know is true said in a way they hadn't expected. He said, "Yes, you're right, being, I will work toward being." I said, "Good." He said, "She said the same thing." He paused. "Elliot told me your mother said something similar." "The night he introduced you." I said, "She's a wise woman." He said, "Yes, she is. I look forward to knowing her better." I said, "She looks forward to it too." This was not entirely accurate. Mama's feelings about Thomas Caldwell were complicated and would require their own separate and ongoing process. But she was a woman of extraordinary capacity, and I believed in that capacity. We shook hands. It was an unusual handshake for a wedding reception. It was the handshake of two people who understood they were at the beginning of a negotiation rather than the end of one. It was the right handshake for the day. Caroline found me later in the evening and she cried, not with the performed warmth, with the real kind, which I had not seen from her before, which I received with some complicated feelings of my own, and with the understanding that crying was the beginning of something and not the resolution of anything. She said, "I'm sorry we made you feel like you had to stand up there and say all of that to get what you deserved." I said, "I had to say it because it was true, not because I was owed a particular response." She said, "You're a remarkable woman." I said, "I know. Elliot knows that too. That's why we're here." She laughed, surprised. And for a moment, just a moment, the warmth was not practiced. Margaret asked to speak to me near the end of the evening. She was subdued in a way I had not seen her subdued before. She said, "I want to say something that I think I should have said a long time ago." I said, "Okay." She said, "I have treated you as a subject, as something to understand and document and contextualize. And that is not how you treat a person. That is not how you treat someone who is becoming your family. And I am sorry for that." I looked at her. I said, "I appreciate that. And I want to say something back." She said, "Yes." I said, "I know that curiosity is how you care. I know the documentary impulse is how you process and engage with the world. I am not asking you to stop being curious about me. I'm asking you to be curious about me the way you're curious about people you love, not people you're studying. There's a difference." She said, "Yes, there is." I said, "Find that difference. That's all I'm asking." She nodded. We were not friends that night. We were not going to be friends overnight. But we were beginning something that had a shape which is more than we had before. Henry danced with me at the reception. He was a bad dancer, and he knew it, and he was completely unbothered by it, which was one of the things I had always liked best about him. He said, over the music, "I'm sorry I waited so long." I said, "You didn't wait too long. You came when it still mattered." He said, 3 weeks earlier would have been," I said. 3 weeks earlier I would have handled it differently. This morning I was standing at the altar with everything visible. I needed to be standing there for it to happen the way it needed to happen." He said, "You're going to be okay, you know, the two of you." I said, "I know." He said, "He loves you more than he knows how to say." I said, "I know that too. The knowing how to say part is what we're working on." He laughed. I danced with my brother. I danced with Simone, who had been managing her feelings all day with the focused efficiency she applied to everything, and who finally let some of them out on the dance floor in the form of enthusiastic movement that was its own kind of celebration. I danced with my mother slowly to a song that had been playing in our kitchen since I was 12, and she held me the way she had held me at every important moment of my life, and she said, against my hair, "I am so proud of you." I said, "For what?" "For making a scene at my own wedding." She said, "For being exactly who I raised you to be." I said, "Which is?" She said, The kind of woman who knows that love is not an excuse for dishonesty and who can say so clearly in a room full of people without losing the love. I said, I almost lost it. She said, but you didn't. I said, no. She said, that's the whole thing, baby. That's the whole thing. I want to tell you about the conversation Elliot and I had that night in the hotel room after the reception had ended and the guests were gone and it was just the two of us in the beginning of the life we had chosen. He sat on the edge of the bed in his evening suit and he looked at me and he said, I need to say it again, without the audience, just to you. I sat beside him. He said, I was afraid. I was afraid that if I told you about my father's call, you would see the whole picture and decide that the whole picture was too much to walk into. I was afraid you would decide that loving me wasn't worth inheriting all of this. All of the family I come with and the history I come with and the specific challenge of being the only one in every room. I said, that was my decision to make. He said, I know that now. I think I knew it then and I chose not to know it because choosing not to know it was easier. I said, yes. He said, I chose my easier over your right to the truth. And I need to understand something, Zara. I need to understand if this is something we're going to be able to actually move through, or if we're going to say we're moving through it and actually be standing still. I said, that depends on what you do next. He said, what does next look like? I said, next looks like you never making that category of decision again. Next looks like you telling me things that are mine to know even when telling me is hard. Next looks like you stopping managing what I can handle and starting trusting that I can handle the truth because I am a woman who has been handling difficult truths her entire life, and I have done it without collapsing. He said, yes. I said, next also looks like you having a real and direct conversation with your father about what happened and what it meant, not an accepting of his change of heart. A real conversation about why the change of heart was required and what it says about the assumptions that made the ultimatum possible in the first place. He said, I will do that. I said, and next looks like this being the last time we are in a situation where I have to stand at a public altar to get information I should have received at a kitchen table. He said, yes. The last time. I said, I believe you. He said, you believe me? I said, I believe that you mean it right now. I believe that meaning it is the beginning of doing it. I believe that people can change the way they make decisions. I have seen it, I believe in it, and I believe you are capable of it. He said, and we're I said, yes, Elliot, we are married, we are here. I walked down that aisle and I said I do and I meant it, not naively, with full information. That is what I chose. He said, what made you choose it? After everything you found out, I thought about this. I said, you proposed to me after your father threatened your inheritance. You stood in front of his money and you chose me. That is real. That counts. And it tells me something true about you that I needed to know. I just needed to know it consciously instead of in the background of a story that was being managed for my comfort. He said, I'm sorry you had to find out the way you did. I said, I'm not. I think I needed to find out at the altar. I think the altar was the right place for it. Because it required me to be certain in the hardest way about what I was choosing and why. And I am certain. He looked at me. He said, you are the most extraordinary person I have ever known. I said, I know. You're going to spend the rest of your life learning what that means. He smiled. The real one, I said, I'm going to hold you to that conversation with your father. He said, I know, I said, and the ones after it. He said, I know, I said, good. Now take this dress off me because I have been wearing it for 13 hours and it is made of approximately 4,000 individual beads. He laughed. It was the best sound in the room. I want to tell you about what happened 6 months after the wedding. Because this story does not end at the altar and does not end at the hotel room and does not end with the neat bow of a resolution. It ends somewhere more accurate than that. 6 months after the wedding, Elliot had the conversation with his father. A real one, at the Wellesley house, just the two of them. I know what was said because Elliot told me, every word, because telling me every word was the practice he had committed to and was keeping. He told his father that the ultimatum had been an act of prejudice regardless of what language it had been dressed in. He told his father that accepting the situation was not the same as welcoming his wife. He told his father that what he needed from him going forward was not tolerance but genuine relationship, or he needed to understand that the distance would be the family's to own. Thomas did not respond immediately. He sat with it for 2 weeks, and then he called Elliot and said he would like to have dinner with Zara. Just the two of them, no agenda, just dinner. I went. We had dinner at a restaurant in Boston that neither of us had chosen, neutral ground, and we talked for 2 hours, and it was not easy, and it was not warm in the way that things are warm when they have always been warm, but it was honest, and I found that I respected Thomas Caldwell's capacity for honesty more than I had expected to. He said, I am going to be incorrect sometimes. I am going to say the wrong thing and make the wrong assumption, and I need you to tell me when I do. I said, I will tell you every time. He said, I know. That is what I'm counting on. We shook hands again. It was a different handshake from the wedding reception. Less negotiation, more foundation. Caroline enrolled in a book club. The book club was formed around texts that I gathered she had been meaning to engage with for years and had found various reasons not to. She sent me an email one evening saying she was reading something that was making her think about things she had not thought about carefully enough before, and she thanked me for being the kind of person who made thinking necessary. It was an unusual email. I saved it. Margaret made a documentary, not about our marriage, about her own family, which is a different thing and a more courageous one. She asked me to watch the rough cut. I did. It was good. It was the work of someone who had finally turned the camera inward. Henry and I talk every week. He had become the brother I had not had in a family I had married into, and that is a specific kind of gift. Elliot tells me things. Every day, things that are mine to know. He has gotten better at it. Not perfect, perfect is not the standard. Real is the standard, but genuinely, measurably better. He tells me things before he manages them. He tells me things before he decides whether they will hurt me. He tells me the truth, and then he lets me have my response to it, and the response is sometimes hard, and he handles the hardness. We are building something. It is imperfect and alive and real. Here is what I believe. I believe that love is not a feeling you maintain through the careful management of information. It is a practice you build through the consistent choice of honesty, even when honesty is expensive. I believe that the moment you decide what someone can handle on their behalf, you have taken something from them that was not yours to take, regardless of how good the intention behind the taking was. I believe that women have been standing in rooms where important information about their own lives was being managed for their comfort for long enough. I believe that the comfort that comes from managed information is the comfort of a smaller life, a life built in the space of what someone else decided you could know, and that is not comfort, it is a cage made of consideration. I believe that standing at an altar and saying what I said is not a dramatic action. It is the most basic one. It is the action of a woman who decided that her full information and her full voice were requirements and not requests, and who was not going to exchange them for the smoothness of a ceremony that had been built on a gap. I believe that families can change, slowly and imperfectly, and at the cost of real work from everyone involved, but they can change. I have seen Thomas Caldwell learn my name and use it. I have seen Caroline's practiced warmth become, in pieces, something that has more warmth in it and less practice. I have seen Margaret turn the camera toward herself. I have seen Henry be brave. I believe that courage is available to people who had not been using it if you give them an unignorable reason to reach for it. I was an unignorable reason. I want to say one more thing before I leave you. The dress is in a box in the guest room of the house Elliot, and I bought in the South End, which is 2 blocks from where I grew up and which I was not going to pretend I did not want to be near. And some days I open the box and I look at the dress, and I think about the woman in the mirror that morning who believed she had all the information. She did not have all the information, but she had herself. She had her mother's raising and her grandmother's spine and her best friend's honesty and her own ability to stand in a room full of difficult truths and say them clearly and choose forward anyway. That turned out to be enough, more than enough. It turned out to be everything. If you are still here with me at the end of this story, I want to speak to you directly. If you are a woman who has been in a room where important information about your life was managed for your comfort, you are not alone. If you have felt the draft of a welcome that was not complete, you are not imagining it. If you have smiled and swallowed things that should not have to be swallowed, your smile does not make those things acceptable. And if you have ever stood at an altar of any kind, a literal one or the metaphorical kind, a boardroom or a family dinner or a relationship's defining moment, and discovered that the ground under you was not exactly what you believed, you already know that the most important question is not what was hidden from you. The most important question is what you do with knowing. What do you do with knowing? I walked down the aisle, not because the information was fine, because I was. Subscribe to Black Diamonds right now. Hit the notification bell. Every week there is a story on this channel that was made for someone who needed it, and I do not want you to miss yours. Drop your name and your city in the comments below. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me if you have ever stood at an altar and had to make a decision in real time. Tell me if you have ever chosen someone after finding out the full truth. Tell me if you are the kind of woman who says the true thing in the hardest room. Drop a if you believed she should have walked out. Drop a if you believed she made the right choice. Drop a if you understand that both of those can be true at the same time. This community sees you, every single one of you. Next week on Black Diamonds, a woman who spent 11 years as the financial architect of her husband's company, who built the models and managed the books and knew where every dollar was and where every dollar came from, who discovered the morning her husband filed for divorce that he had structured the company in a way that classified her contributions as administrative rather than foundational. What she found when she looked more closely, what she hired a forensic accountant to uncover, and the deposition that made 3 lawyers go quiet at the same time. That story is coming. Make sure your notifications are on. Because what she found changes everything. Until then, this is Black Diamonds. We see you. We have always seen you.